Bonjour, chers amis, chers collègues. C'est un plaisir de vous retrouver aujourd'hui pour cette nouvelle séance du séminaire Riwaq qui est organisée en partenariat avec l'IFAO et l'Université d'Ain Shams. Donc, merci à l'équipe dynamique, en particulier avec toute l'équipe. Je salue le travail de mon collègue et ami Ahmed Chouki. Donc, ce séminaire donne l'occasion de mêler des spécialistes égyptiens et étrangers d'archéologie copte et islamique. Et aujourd'hui, nous avons le plaisir et l'honneur d'accueillir le professeur Lincoln Blumel qui va nous parler de Didymus, l'aveugle et le papyrus de la Torah. الأصدقاء والزملاء والأعزاء يسعدني الترحيب بكم اليوم في هذه الحلقة الجديدة من ندوة رواق والذي ينظمها المعهد العلمي الفرنسي للآثار الشرقية بالتعاون مع كلية الآثار جامعة عين شمس. يقوم بتنظيم هذه الندوة فريق ديناميكي على رأس زميلي وصديقي أستاذ دكتور أحمد شوكي. وهذه الندوة توفر فرصة المزج بين المتخصصين المصريين والأجانب في الآثار القبطية والإسلامية. ويسعدنا اليوم أن نرحب بروفيسور لينكولن بلوميل ويشرفنا لينكولن بالحديث عن ديديموس الضرير وبرديات التوراة التي تم اكتشافه في القاهرة. شكرا لك زميلي العزيز، وإن شاء الله تقدم البروفيسور أنت. تفضل يا حبيبي.
In the beginning, it's a pleasure to have Professor Lincoln Blumel and his lecture today. And of course, it's come back to Dr. Noha Salim, the head of the Department of Greek-Roman Archaeology in the Faculty of Archaeology at Ain Shams University. I will let her to introduce Professor Blumel, but I will give you a brief about Seminar Riwaq, which started since 2019 with IFAO. And we make until now it's 9 sessions. We start, of course, because of coronavirus, and we make a meeting for young researcher. It was about the Mamluk, what is new in the Mamluk studies. And of course, we now planning to make another one soon. It's about Islamic manuscripts and what is new in its studies. It will be for the young researcher, and of course, the professors and specialists will be invited. In the beginning, I would, at the beginning, I would thank my dear friend, Dr. Abbas, for his support about the cooperation between the IFAO and Faculty of Archaeology, which not stop on this seminar, but also there is excavation which funded by IFAO in Upper Egypt, which also in cooperate with Faculty of Archaeology and Shams University. And soon we will have, inshallah, a big project. We will announce it soon. I will not speak a lot, but I will let my colleague, Professor Noha Salim, to introduce our guest, Professor Noha. Thank you.
We would like to welcome everyone who comes to us today physically or coming with Zoom meeting. We are happy to get you all with us today. We have the pleasure to get such a very known professor in his field, Professor Blomel, and his colleague Paul. Now, first of all, I would thank Professor Dr. Mamdouh Damati, the Dean of the Faculty, for his leadership, and Professor Ahmed Shouki for giving the chance to attend this lecture here in the IFAO with Dr. Abbas and his hosting at IFAO. Thank you very much. And for Professor Blomel, we have a very specialist. He is a full professor in the Department of Ancient Scripture at Brigham Young University. He holds a graduate degree from the University of Calgary, University of Oxford, University of Toronto. He specializes in early Christianity and Greek Coptic papyrology and epigraphy. He has published 4 books and over 70 articles. Now, I'll shorten my talk and give the chance to all we can listen to your very important lecture. You are very welcome here, and you can start, Professor Blomel. Thank you.
All right, I want to thank you all for coming today. It's a real honor and pleasure to be here. I want to thank the IFAO for this opportunity, as well as NOAA for organizing this with Ain Shams University. And I hope what I have to say to you for the next 40 minutes will be of some interest and some use for individual studies. I know there's a number of people here working in related fields, archaeology, papyrology, art studies, from faculty from various universities, institutions. So it's a real pleasure to be here, and I look forward to some of our discussion afterwards. What I want to do for the next 40 minutes is I want to discuss what I consider a very important find from not very far from here in Tura in early 1940s. And a little bit interesting story, because I was involved recently in publishing a number of pages from an important codex that was discovered there in 1941, that through a series of very fortuitous events ended up at my university halfway around the world in Utah. And so I'll begin there, and I will then talk about the person this text belongs to, a man called Didymus the Blind, and his contribution to Christianity in the 4th century, and kind of tie that in with what was then in the codex and the codices that were actually found. And so my lecture really begins back at the start of World War II. You had British forces stationed here in Egypt, and they approached King Farouk I if they could use the quarries in Tura to go and store munitions. And so they did receive agreement to do that. And so in the summer and fall of 1941, they first of all had an engineer survey team go and begin charting out some of these caves where they're going to put some supplies and munitions. And it was during the charting out of some of these caves, and there was a cave in particular that was number 35 in their chart, that they discovered a number of pages of papyri, codices, that were discovered there in 1941. And so you can see here on this next slide, these are some of the very earliest pictures of these manuscripts that were discovered. In fact, in total, they figure there were about 2,000 folia. And so this is really an enormous number of texts. Now, when these were discovered, the soldiers who were discovered and the engineers who were there on site when these were discovered began dividing these up among themselves. And so while word did reach back to Egyptian authorities, and even all the way ultimately to King Farouk I, and an effort was made to reclaim a number of these papyri, and many were reclaimed and are today in the Egyptian Museum. A number of them were smuggled out of the country and then began appearing on the antiquities market following World War II. And in fact, most of them ended up in collections in Cologne, in Germany, the British Museum, in Geneva at the Martin Bodmer Library, and a few even ended up in the US. And so I'll talk a little bit more about those texts. And of course, these were discovered, right? It didn't make a huge splash because, of course, there were much larger things going on in the world with a world war that was just beginning. And even afterwards, this discovery was largely eclipsed by the discovery in the late 40s of the Nag Hammadi codices here in Egypt, as well as the Dead Sea Scrolls. And so important find, but not as well known as some others that were discovered in the same decade. Well, work began really on this material in about the 1950s and 60s, initially with German scholars out of Cologne, also with French scholars beginning work on this. And it was determined that these papyri, basically what was discovered in 1941 was a series of 8 codices or 8 books. And these 8 books preserve, and they're numbered here in this way with Codex 8 not really being, it's kind of for convenience with number of sheets that they said, okay, this is kind of what's left over. We'll call this a codex just for, for organizational sake, belong to the writings of Origen, a very famous Christian interpreter here in Alexandria in the early 3rd century, who ultimately relocated to Caesarea because of a dispute with the patriarch Demetrius in the early 3rd century. He's a very prolific writer. In fact, probably the most prolific writer in Christian antiquity, certainly before the time of Augustine. And also, the other individual whose writings were preserved, really quite miraculously, was Didymus the Blind, a very famous 4th century Christian interpreter of the scriptures, who was actually not known very well prior to this time. Didymus was talked about by contemporaries like Jerome, Evagrius, Palladius, and others. Rufinus mentions him, Sosman, Socrates a little bit later. Ecclesiastical historians talk about him, but not really a whole lot was known about Didymus. And so what you had then now is over 1,700 pages of a Christian writer. And just to kind of give you the importance of this, at least for the study of early Christianity, I can't think of another Christian writer for the first 5 centuries of Christianity for which we know them primarily through ancient texts, right? We think of, the study of early Christianity. Often we're dealing with the writings of a Christian writer, and this goes on in the ancient world, and generally, we're usually dealing with medieval manuscripts written hundreds and hundreds of years after the fact, right, that talk about an earlier period. But here we have, with a writer, right, over 1,700 pages of, right, their own texts. And so it's really quite remarkable. And so I want to talk a bit about Didymus, some more about this find, and kind of flesh out what's important about some of the things we're seeing here, because one of the things we get to see with these texts is, as a papyrologist, we actually get to autopsy the text and see, well, how was this written? And there's details in the papyri that give us hints about what they were actually relating to. And I want to flesh some of that out, because actually I think it's quite exciting, especially when we think of what I'll be talking about is ancient Christian pedagogy and teaching in 4th century Alexandria, which we of course know was really the intellectual hub in many ways of late antiquity and certainly the earlier Roman Empire. So with Didymus, just a few things about him. Born in the early 4th century and him dying roughly around 398. In his own lifetime, he was widely regarded as an important teacher. As best as we can tell, based on the few scattered sources about him, he probably begins teaching in Alexandria sometime in the 350s and teaches up until his death around 398. What's really remarkable is people like Jerome talk about Didymus. Of course, Jerome is this giant in ancient Christianity, right? Produces the Vulgate, a number of biblical commentaries, talks about Didymus in largely glowing terms, and actually comes and will learn from Didymus, as do others. In fact, maybe even Gregory Nazianzus, who makes a trip to Alexandria around the year 349, 350, seems to also talk about, in Greek, this quote unquote Gnostikos, or this really learned one, right, who has all this knowledge, who's almost certainly Didymus. And so this is really high praise from a number of later Christian writers who were very influential. We know he writes a lot of biblical commentaries. Jerome actually talks about him in his Lives of Illustrious Men as producing all these commentaries. But again, prior to 1941, very little was known about Didymus, relatively speaking, considered to the impact he had in 4th century Christianity. Now, the reason for that is because posthumously Didymus will be condemned. And so at the 5th Ecumenical Council of Constantinople in 553, he will be anathematized along with Origen and others for various reasons. Those that are actually explicitly stated, the two that come up is the first one is that Didymus did believe in the pre-existence of the soul, as did Origen. The soul existed, prior to coming here, and it's basically eternal. In fact, not many accused him and Origen being not unlike Plato, where they talked about the soul was eternal. And by the time of the 4th century, that wasn't acceptable for various ontological reasons in Christianity. So that was one reason it was condemned. Another stated reason was because they didn't like his allegorical exegesis of certain passages. And so what likely happened then, as well as with Origen, is their writings fall out of disuse. And so people no longer copy them. And over time, people forget them. And so even with Origen, a lot of his writings, of course, had disappeared because they were not copied and recopied. And so really the only writing that was transmitted by Didymus in kind of medieval scriptoria was his work on the Trinity, which people felt, okay, this is quote unquote orthodox, we will, circulate this. But otherwise, all of his writings fell into disuse until, of course, the discovery in Torah. Now, probably why these texts were placed here, in Torah, I think probably the best way to explain this is just up and not far, maybe about 1.5 miles or so from where a number of these caves are, in cave number 35. There was the medieval monastery. They're called, in the medieval period, the monastery of the Mule, but very likely the monastery of Arsenius, which we know in the 5th century. There's a church father, Arsenius, who was in Scetis for a time and then ultimately relocated to Torah. And likely these texts originally were there. And probably what happened is in the year AD 649, the Lateran Council, both Origen and Didymus, as well as others, are formally condemned as heretics. And probably what happens is I imagine their writings are removed from the library at this point. And then probably, some monk then deposited them there in the cave, perhaps maybe thinking at some point they might be rehabilitated and maybe go and get the writings, but they never actually come back. And so they remain there until they're discovered again in 1941. And in fact, this is not unlike at least one theory with the Nag Hammadi codices that were discovered here in the later 40s, is some people view these as perhaps in light of Athanasius. He has this very famous Festal letter issued in the year AD 367. It's Festal letter number 39, wherein he talks about this ought to be the New Testament canon, basically. He says, here's the writings we're going to use as scripture. And this is the first time, by the way, in Christian writing, you have what will become the 27-book canon of the New Testament is attested. And so some wonder if perhaps those writings were similarly deposited or removed at that period, and that was being influenced. And so I think probably this is influenced in the 6th century. We do know from Cyril of Scythopolis that people are reading Didymus into the 5th and 6th century. Then he kind of seems to disappear largely. And I think we can probably piece this together. So probably along with Origen, his writings are removed from the monastery, which is located nearby, and then of course then discovered. Now, what's interesting here is when we look at all these texts here, really codices, 3 through 7, which all relate to Didymus. And I'm going to talk primarily about the Psalms Codex today, because that was the one that I worked on and published a number of sheets. And so what we know is that, people, when they discovered this, began keeping it or sending it home, and these things began appearing in Europe after World War II. Well, we know there was an American serviceman that will ultimately come and be stationed in Egypt. This is after 1941. This is more into 1942 or 43. And he gets a hold of one of the choirs of this codex. And it's not altogether clear how this happens. And he then sends this back home to a brother-in-law who's living in Boston as kind of a cultural keepsake. Well, look what I found. And the brother-in-law says, well, thank you. And what then happens is all these papyri here, which will ultimately end up at BYU, sit in an attic in Boston for about 30 years. and they will occasionally, right, show these items to friends and family and say, look at these papyri, but no one knows what's on them. Well, this brother-in-law dies in the late 1970s, and his widow determines and says, well, we probably ought to go and, right, doing some cleaning, get rid of these, not throw them out, fortunately. And so she has a family friend actually go to nearby Harvard University. And this person shows up from papyri and goes to the classics department, says, would you like to buy some papyri? And you can understand that many people there are very suspicious. Who is this person showing up, doing this? And there's some irony here. There was a classicist or a Greek philologist, Albert Heinrichs, who worked at Harvard for a number of years, died about a decade ago, who actually, with Ludwig Koenen in Cologne, actually edited a number of the papyri from Tura when he was a graduate student in Germany, who, when the family friend showed up, he was actually in Europe working on the Job commentary, which is kind of strange that somebody shows up and he's away. And so no one had any interest. And so ultimately this friend was connected to BYU. And so in the early 1980s, BYU acquired these papyri. In total, there were 22. And these preserved portions from not Quire, but Quinian 8 of the Psalms Codex. When you think of ancient bookmaking, the way they would make ancient books is you have basically, right, 4 folia, you fold them over, and you get 16 pages. And so in this case, it was actually 5 folios, actually 20 pages, and then 2 more were then added on from Psalm 36. And so that was acquired by BYU. It was very important, at the time when BYU acquired these in 1983, but they more or less just sat in special collections, well, for nearly 40 years before they were published, and my work as editor with a few others, work as lead editor, publishing these just a couple of years ago. And so I want to kind of look at these Didymus really through the lens of what we find in the Psalm commentary. And by the way, you can kind of see how this codex got divided up, right? So you have, it's, literally it's in, of course, lots here in the Egyptian Museum, it's in Cologne, it's in the British Library, it's in Geneva, and then there are some here, of course, in BYU. Now, when you look at this text, and this is where I think being able to autopsy the actual papyri can tell us more about this. There's important things, I think, in the edition I worked on that are now kind of new ways to look at Didymus. Is you have right here is the first sheet, and you can see up here in the top left-hand corner, the Ada, which is the Quire number. So this is Quire number 8. And you then see the text there. And what's interesting here, you have these 5 codices. And as I began, studying this and then looking at, images of the others, it becomes very clear that the codex that preserved his commentary on the Psalms is written in the very same hand that preserves the commentary on Ecclesiastes. And for those of you that are familiar with, papyrology, you look at the hand, and it's not a very elegant hand. It's what I might call a more documentary hand, which is unusual. When you look at Greek papyri especially, you can quickly look at this, and if the hand's very cursive, you'll say, well, that must be a document, a receipt, a letter, a will. Or if it is a very nice book hand, you'll say, well, that must probably be something of Homer or something else, or a treatise. But this here is written in a documentary hand, whereas when you look, for example, at the papyri that preserve the codices like of Genesis or Zechariah of Job, it's a very different hand. It's a book hand. And so already you're seeing a difference here. And so this is something that I think comes out when you look at what these are. And so I'm going to return to that. But you look here and you're like, oh, that's very nice, Greek hand, whereas that of Psalms is quite different and quite cursive. Something else that you'll notice when you begin looking at these commentaries, that only in the Psalms commentary, and I'll stick with commentary, I think actually I would actually say, to be really precise, I would say the Psalms lectures, and I'll say more about that, is what you notice as you begin working through this, and also with Ecclesiastes, is you will periodically in the text see this abbreviation right here, epsilon pi epsilon rho with this long oblique stroke, which must be an abbreviation for the Greek verb or some form of eperotao or question. So there's a question, and then you have something that follows. I think this case, right, in Greek is, how could a saint say this? And what is the saint then saying? Well, it's now based on the psalm, do not drag me away with sinners. And what's interesting here is you have all these questions that begin to interrupt the commentary. And these aren't rhetorical questions, right? When you read, dialogues, they'll throw a rhetorical question and they'll answer it. They're questions that really interrupt the flow. And you keep seeing these, it then becomes very clear. You find his responses that if you think about this in a sense of a commentary, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense unless, and this I think where it becomes important, we're looking at actual lectures that were given in an Alexandria classroom that were written down by stenographers. And so what I argued then, and really built upon what some others had said in the publication, was what we have is that we're seeing in the Psalms lectures and the Ecclesiastes lectures is an actual classroom lecture given on select chapters of Psalms and Ecclesiastes from the 4th century. And there's all these oral elements that you don't find in Genesis, Job, or Zechariah, which shows these are more refined, where they're written down for a readership as opposed to Didymus now speaking, and now students are asking questions. In fact, Didymus will even begin arguing with them at times during the lecture. You have other features, for example, and I just include some of these, to temporal references, where he's speaking, he says, well, yesterday I said this. And if you go back a few pages in the papyrus, he'll say, oh my goodness, he said this 3 pages earlier. And so it's very clear now that we're actually in a lecture-like setting. And so what I'm imagining is going on here with these papyri is Didymus is giving lectures, and you have stenographers who are now recording this as he goes along. And we have examples of this in early Christianity. Of course, in legal proceedings, when you read papyri, there's all kind of references to, court stenographers, things like this. But Origen, for example, there's a very famous passage in Eusebius that says, because he was so well respected, he would have at one time 7 stenographers in a lecture who would be basically relieving each other as he would be speaking. And then they would then go and write this out. So this is what's going on in Didymus's lectures. We're seeing the actual classroom lectures here. And this is why I think the hand is so different in Ecclesiastes and Psalms. What I'm imagining happening is he's giving a lecture and you're having this written out in shorthand. And then what we know happens, so Jerome, for example, talks about when he was composing his commentary on Ephesians, he said, I had to do this really quickly. And so I just began dictating to stenographers. And they'd quickly write it down in a Greek shorthand. And then he said these stenographers would then go and they would write it out in what we'd call in Greek scriptio plane. So they'd write out full on in Greek. He says, I would then go reread that and then start adapting it, changing it, saying, I don't want to say this, and then work it up into a proper commentary, right? Excising student questions, compressing things. And what I think we're seeing here is where Zechariah commentary, Job commentary, and Genesis commentary are probably at one point originated as, in the classroom lectures, and they end up right in that kind of, I'll say, a published form, so to speak, is that we have in these 2 texts, we don't have the final copies. Presumably there's a final copy, but we're finding this kind of intermediate stage where we're seeing the actual classroom lectures. And so this really interesting window now into a Christian classroom in the 4th century in Alexandria. And I can't think of anything, at least in the Christian context, like this for the first 4 centuries. Then it's highly unusual. And so it's fascinating to see, how would a Christian teacher go and teach the scriptures in Alexandria? And presumably, I think there's a lot of parallels with this elsewhere. And one of the things I think was quite fascinating that I noticed in the text, that the people who'd worked on parts of this codex, I think missed, is, for example, you'll find here, is the way this commentary or lecture works is they will have a quote of a scripture, and then there's discussion. And then a quote of a scripture, and usually it's done by a verse or a half verse. And then you'll have, commentary on that. So in one sense, it's very systematic. However, when you've been reading his comments, Didymus, I would say here, is that digression is the rule rather than the exception. He's constantly digressing, which again kind of fits into a little bit like a lecture. In fact, I think Didymus didn't have great notes, to be entirely honest, constantly digressing from notes and talking a lot. What's interesting about social history. So he'll talk about, well, not long ago, there was somebody in the city and there's a corrupt judge who in the case. And so when you read this lecture, you find a lot about the social history inadvertently in Alexandria in the 4th century. But something that is really quite interesting is at times you'll have the lemma, right? Here you have in the Greek, you shall destroy them, right? Or tear them down, and you shall not build them up. It's repeated twice. And so some of the earlier, sections that were completed by German scholars, they said, well, what this is basically is we have some notes here, and somebody came along later on, started putting the verses in, but they're really sloppy. I don't think that works so well. In fact, what I think is going on here is why they're repeated. And where I came to this conclusion is we do have in the 5th century a Neoplatonic philosopher, Olympiodorus, here in Alexandria, who lectures on Plato. And we know that he's lecturing right in the classroom. In fact, it even says, right, you have in Greek, there in lectures, apophones, or from the voice, he's lecturing. And when he's teaching on Plato in Alexandria in the 5th century, we know that in fact there's a lector there that has a copy of Plato's, in this case Gorgias, who will now read a section from Plato, and then he will then speak. And what happens is he will be speaking to Olympiodorus, he'll speak, and then he'll stop, and the lector will think, oh, he's done that section, let me now go on and read some more Plato. He reads some more Plato, and they say, oh, I have some more to say now. And so the next 2 pages go back to the previous material, so the lector then repeats the Plato portion again. So the lemata are all out of order. Well, what I think is happening is this very thing. It's not there's some sloppy person coming along saying, let's put a verse here and a verse there. It's in a classroom, Didymus maybe stops, the lector who's reading from the Psalm says, oh, I guess I'll now read the next passage. And Didymus say, oh, I have another thing I want to make, another point. And so he digresses back. And so again, this kind of helps us understand the classroom context where you have a lector, Didymus is speaking, and the scripture then is being read. So this is kind of a little bit what you can tell. And again, I think without, actually being able to autopsy the actual papyri, probably some of these details do not become clear, right? With the handwriting and things like this. It's always so nice to have what I would call, right, the autograph copy or an early copy here of a text, which tells us something about the transmission history. And, even the text itself is an artifact, right? We always think, well, there's artifact over here and there's text over here. Well, I think there's actually a lot of blending here. Text is artifact. In this regard, so something that will tell us about, right, the mise en page, right, of the page of how it's being used here. So he's in a classroom in Alexandria and he's teaching. Now we do have, right, for wondering, what kind of teacher was Didymus? You do have, right, Christian writers, and I won't read these, but you can certainly take a moment and look what they say. They talk about Didymus being very experienced, right? That he would, for example, in his exegesis or interpretation of various passages, might bring in, right, logic or geometry or astronomy, right, philosophical concepts to go and to, help elucidate a passage of the text. And I think you do see this, right? So in Didymus lectures, right, you'll have, right, it'll go through kind of on one hand, very, right, systematically from verse to verse, but he will go all over the place, where he will talk about a passage and he'll move from place to place. But what's interesting here, I think, is to really look at how Didymus is teaching. I think while these are helpful on one hand, I think when you really get into, the Psalms and then Ecclesiastes, codices, is there's a quote here by a grammarian, right, Dionysius Thrax. Now, granted, he does live, some centuries before Didymus, but he talks about what does a grammarian do, right? You all know about ancient education. There's various stages that people would go through leading up to, right? Rhetoric. Here in Egypt, we know certainly rhetorical education would be taught in Alexandria. We know about other cities, there might be some on a lesser degree, but you could certainly, learn grammar as you progress through various stages. Of course, Raphael Acribiori has talked lots about this in the papyri and done a lot of good work. But I just want to talk about what he says about, grammar. And what's interesting, when you think about this, you then look at what Didymus starts to do, you quickly realize what Didymus is doing here is he's not just explicating scripture, he's to some degree teaching the students grammar and showing them how grammar and the conventional rules of grammar can be applied to help interpret the scriptures. And this is not unlike what's going on in Christianity. Also, you use philosophy, right? We can use Aristotle and Plato to begin to understand, right, Christian, right, theological concepts. He's now using grammar and some rules in grammar and teaching them, this is how you go when you now begin to parse and read a text. And so look what Dionysius Thrax says. He says, grammatike is an imperia, right, in Greek. So it's an acquired expertise. So how does one get this? Of the general usage of poets and prose writers. And then he goes on and says, look, there are really now 6 parts to this, right? It has 6 parts. First, accurate reading with due regard for prosody. So how you read a text, right? The intonation, things like that, you're getting the right sense. In fact, I think Augustine will often complain that people read a text with the wrong prosody and then the meaning is then lost, right? Part of this is, right, explanation of literary devices, right? There is, right, provision of notes on phraseology, right? And subject matter, right? There's the discovery of etymology, right? You'll often find in a classical education, well, what do words mean as you begin to unpack their meaning, right? There's working out of analogical regularities, and then kind of really then a really critical study of literature. He says, which is the finest part of the techne, or this art of grammar? Now, if you keep this in mind, start to read Didymus, you really see Didymus at times doing these things. And so I want to give a couple examples. Again, you just kind of read this over and don't notice this, but you say, wait a second here. It's very clear he's finding some kind of grammatical curricula as he is working and leading his students through this. Now, when we think about the students, you look at their questions. When I look at the students, I don't think these students are, probably like Jerome or something like this, because I think some can be fairly elementary, but these are not young children either. These are probably people, perhaps monastics, or others. And we do know that, in fact, there's, of course, men there, but also some women based on questions, because the feminine will be used, right, in the Greek, that are there in the audience. And so I might imagine a classroom of anywhere, we think of other classrooms, maybe on the low end, a few to maybe a couple dozen that are there, in addition to stenographers that Didymus is then lecturing to. And he's now teaching, well, how do you read scripture? And he's using what you already have established in kind of, usage of grammarians and, conventional ways to interpret texts, right? So, for example, people reading Homer, and we know that a lot of good, when you look at texts on Homer, right, and all kinds of academic approaches to Homer, it really starts in Alexandria, of course, much earlier, already in the Ptolemaic period. And we're now seeing this in these lectures now with Didymus applying some of the same things to Christian literature that done previously to classical literature on a level we don't see elsewhere in other Christian texts. So when you read his commentaries, he will talk more theologically. And there's certainly theological material here. But for example, I'll give a couple examples here. As he goes through and begins to talk about different passages, he will start parsing and saying, look, when you read this passage here, don't read it as a verb, but read it now here as the dative. So, for example, in the commentary on Psalm 28:4, right? The voice of the Lord in strength. And then as you read down here, it says, here, I take it as the dative case of the feminine noun. Now, what he's talking about here in the passage, you have this word in strength in Greek, eniskouo, and here it's eniskouē. But you can actually, right, when you look at the way this text is read, right, when we, of course, read text today, at least, right, well, in English, other languages, we have word spacing. And word spacing is a form of interpretation, right? Because it helps you divide a text, okay, and you can follow it along. If you notice here, right, in ancient Greek, you don't have word spacing. You will eventually get into the much later, Byzantine period, you'll start spacing, but they write out what's called scriptio plane, right? And so they write this out, or I should say, scriptio continua. And so what you're getting here is when he says this, and saying, look, the way you ought to read this is not as a verb, but as a noun in the dative. Well, the way, eniskouē could be read is, well, do you read it with en, the preposition in strength, or just, a compound verb with a prepositional prefix? And he's saying this is how you ought to go and read this end. So it's now, instead of saying the voice of the Lord, right, is strengthening, it's in strength, or the voice of the Lord strengthens. Now, he does admit here saying, well, there's not a huge difference, but there's these little grammatical details he will constantly be reminding the student of that he goes through, which is, again, a form of, right, this work of a grammarian, which, as we see back here, going back to Dionysius, right, it's accurate reading. And so he'll constantly be reminding the students of this only in Psalms and Ecclesiastes, but not in the, right, I would say kind of, final copies of his commentaries, thinking, well, I don't need to go to this for the reader. There are more important, right, issues, perhaps, right, theological I want to address. What you also see here in these texts is Didymus loves etymologies, and he will not do this as much in his, right, I would say, published versions. Now, he will do in his published version etymologies of Hebrew words. It is interesting when you read literature, people, when they come across Hebrew words, they're wondering, what do these mean? In fact, I can think of a famous papyrus from Oxyrhynchus worked a little bit on, where it is a list of Hebrew etymologies, right? People come across these words and say, okay, what does this mean? It's totally foreign to Greek. So he'll do some of that, even his, published editions, but he will constantly be throwing in etymologies. And so here's just one that he mentions that I bring to your attention. So you have this passage here in Psalm 22, 5c, and your cup makes me drunk in the best way. Now, again, he doesn't like this word, right, drunk and drunkenness. He says, well, what it actually is, it's not real drunkenness, right? He says it's this oxymoron. It's a sober drunkenness, right, which means rejoicing, which, by the way, Philo of Alexandria already does the same thing. But he then goes on and then gives an etymology and says, well, here is now this term drunkenness. It's explained in the following way. There was not abundance of wine in ancient times. When the fruit of the vine, which produces wine, was just discovered, they drank it both at feasts and at the public festivals after offering sacrifices. They did not drink it on any other occasion. Wherefore, it is called drunkenness. And so he gives this explanation. And where this explanation, if you track this down, ultimately goes back to, it goes back to Aristotle's Symposium, where you have, right, meta to thuein. So you have then meta, right, this preposition with an articular infinitive. And this is allegedly, right, this then root for the word drunkenness. And so you'll find him constantly giving etymologies of words. And this is Greek etymologies, right? Which you may not seem would be that needful in a commentary. But again, as you look at grammar, right? Well, fourth, the discovery of etymologies. And so you're seeing here using this technique of a grammarian to teach, right, Christian students how to begin to approach and read the text. Now, something else is really quite interesting here is, right, we talk about the critical study. And there's various ways, of course, to be critical on this, but one I find fascinating, which again does not appear in Genesis, Zechariah, or Job, is that Didymus will talk about textual variants. And so we have, of course, textual, right, criticism when you have multiple ancient texts and they all have a slightly different reading. What then is the original or the best reading? And so Didymus will actually bring this up multiple times in his Psalm commentaries, also Ecclesiastes, and talk about, well, there's different readings here. What one is the best? In fact, what Didymus often tends to do is he tends not to arbitrate and says, well, they can both work. And he then, goes with either one. When you think about Origen, and Origen was some time earlier, Origen is really, I would say, centuries ahead of his time, because he is the first Christian author to deal in any substantive way with textual criticism. Of course, you may have heard of his Hexapla, his six-fold column of, right, the Hebrew Bible, where he puts up Hebrew, right? He then puts up a transliteration, puts up in multiple Greek recensions of the Septuagint, Theodotion, Aquila, and others, and is very concerned about this because it can have big implications for how you read a text. And so we're seeing Didymus do this, right, at kind of a deeper level of a critical reading of a text, which again does not come out in his later commentaries. And so if you begin to look at this, you see a really interesting classroom begin to emerge with students and how he's teaching them to approach Scripture. Now, what I want to do as I begin to conclude here is I want to go back to and talk about maybe a more conventional way, at least based on literary sources in which Didymus will read a text. And he will do all this, right? He will, kind of incorporate grammar, but it's grammar so they can understand text better. But if you were to ask me, well, what is Didymus really trying to do with students? Well, yes, he's trying to teach them how to read a text, but Didymus is thoroughly protreptic in Psalms and Ecclesiastes, meaning you're reading Scripture so you can become a better person or a better disciple. And so a lot of it's about the acquisition of virtue. And so we'll talk a lot about this, or in Greek, mimesis. It's mimicking biblical figures and what they do. So it's this exhortation to be better. And for Didymus, one of these ideas, right, is in a sense, in small degree, right, this mimesis of the divine. And so, right, you have God who is in Greek, right, teleos, it's complete, perfect. And so Didymus says, well, what we're trying to do is we're trying to mimic that. And so he will constantly be telling the students, right, in a protreptic way to enjoin them to better virtue, as well as teaching them to read the text. And this is constant throughout. This is certainly part of this curriculum. And so I want to just share with you kind of a really interesting way. It was a passage I spent a lot of time working on, really struggled with it for, well, a long, long time. And it comes from here, Psalm 28. And so you can see here, what you'll find in the Codex is you'll see over here, right, you'll see Kappa Eta, which Kappa is 20, Eta is 8. And then you oversee here, right, a psalm, right, to David, right, for the exodus of the tent, right? So this is the Feast of Tabernacles or the Solemn Assembly. And with with this little oblique stroke, and then his commentary begins. So we know that this is the beginning of Psalm 28. And usually when he begins a psalm, he'll kind of have this introduction to it. And in this introduction, which is really quite interesting, what we're going to find, I'm going to read it from the translation that I gave in the book, is you'll find him here bringing in elements of geometry, arithmetic, and astronomy. on how you read this text, but ultimately the goal here is to, well, how can you have right moral advancement toward virtue? And so he reads this, and it's also a nice example of how he will now allegorically read a text. When you read Psalm 28, yes, it's about tabernacles. But Didymus says, well, that's just the surface reading, right? Like Origen, oh, that's the surface reading, but we want to get into the deeper meaning of this, right? What is the allegorical meaning, which then can help your soul progress? And so let me begin reading, right, this translation here of this and what I have, and you can we'll kind of follow along. And while I find this very interesting, I'm not convinced this is what Psalm 28 is about, but I will give Didymus great points for creativity on this. A very creative reading, but again, because this point of this progression of the soul. And so here's how it starts here. I'll start reading down here, just a couple paragraphs. So you get a sense then for Didymus and what he's doing here, right? So we have the lemma, right? So a psalm to David for, right, the exodus of the tent or the solemn assembly. And then he says this: during the Feast of Tabernacles, when the whole festival was completed, after it was celebrated for 7 days, the priests who were officiating inside exited the tabernacle on the 8th day. That day is called the solemn assembly. The divine law stipulates 3 times of the year for celebrating major festivals. These are public festivals. New moons, Sabbaths, and the fast are neither as important nor as large. The following are the major public festivals: the Passover, the Pentecost, also called the Feast of Weeks, and the Feast of Tabernacles, which takes place in the 7th month of the year, while the Passover takes place in the 1st month. Okay, so saying, right, this is now talking about Tabernacle, 7th month of the year. The 7th month is diametrically opposed to the 1st. And then he goes off and makes this interesting connection now with Passover and Tabernacles. And what he will do here, as you see, he's going to say it's diametrically opposed to the 1st month. And we have to think about the zodiac here, right? If you look here, right, with Passover, right, being in Nisan or Aries, it's directly opposite, right, Libra or Tishri, when you have tabernacles. And so he's saying they're diametrically opposed, therefore they're connected, right, with this 1 and 7. So we're getting here a little bit of that point, saying he loved to incorporate, right, astronomy or astronomical principles into his writing. So I thought it's a nice passage illustrating this, right? So the 7th month is diametrically opposed to the 1st, just as the 1st through the 6th months comprise half of the year, so also the 7th through the 12th month comprise the other half of the year. Thus, they are diametrically opposed. The Passover takes place when the sun is in Aries. The Feast of Tabernacles celebrated when it is Libra. The feast beginning at the new moon is the Feast of Trumpets and is not a public festival. On the 10th day of the 7th month, they hold the fast, which is set apart to humble the soul. So he's talking about now later on there about Yom Kippur. He mentioned that briefly. And then he'll say this: so the month is the 7th, and for this reason, the psalm sung about the solemn assembly is fittingly the 28th. Now, what he then does, he says, okay, so it's really important and it's connected with the number 7. And what he will do here, and I won't read this, but what he's going to explain is he then goes in using geometry and mathematics, a whole digression about an equilateral triangle. And you're wondering, okay, what is he trying to do here? But he makes this point and says this. He says 7 is this really unique number, right? It has, and he'll quote Hebrews, neither mother nor father, right? Because it's this prime number, it's unique. And he says, when you begin to construct a triangle, and when you think of ancient mathematics, right, like certainly, pre-Cartesian mathematics, you have to think certainly anciently, they always thought of things geometrically. So when you think of a number, you're thinking of a shape. So there are numbers that are associated, right? There's square numbers. So when ancients talk about square numbers, right, they'll talk about, right, the number 4. Well, it's 4 because you have, quadrants, that's a square. Or 9, that's the next square number. I think squares. You will have people like Euclid or Nicomachus, when they talk about numbers, say, well, there's triangular numbers. And so, for example, a triangular number would be 3, because you go 1, 2, 3, and you can go down, right? You have 6 as a triangular number. This is kind of in their thinking of this. And what Didymus says here, and it's where you get into some numerology, but it's going to be used to serve his main point about the progression, is he says, look, if you have, right, 28 is a triangular number. And if you have 28, it has 7 on each side, which is this unique number. And he says, look what's going on here, right? Tabernacles in the 7th month. How we're seeing now the number 7 is kind of a deeper meaning. And it fits accordingly with Psalm 28. And he says, well, Psalm 28 actually is a very important number because, as we all know, he says 28 is a quote unquote perfect number. So with Euclid, And more with Nicomachus, they say, well, there's these perfect numbers. And then people like the Pythagoreans will take them on and say, well, they have a certain, esoteric quality to them. And what a perfect number is, first of all, is 6. And why is it a perfect number? Because it's the sum of its factors. So 1 plus 2 plus 3 equals 6. It's perfect. What's the next perfect number? Well, it's 28, right? Because 1 plus 2 plus 4 plus 7 plus 14 equals 28. I think the next perfect number is 196. And so you'll use this as a starting point and say, well, this is Psalm 28. It's now related to the 7th month. It's all connected. And he says, what really is going on here is you might think this psalm is just about, right, tabernacles and exiting, right, the tabernacle. What it is, it's now exiting, right, the earthly tabernacle and moving on to 28, which is perfection or to divinity. And so you'll now have this allegorical reading, which goes well beyond, right, what's actually there in the Psalms. But it's telling students, like, it's much deeper, and it's about your progression. You leave a physical house and go to a spiritual house. And here it's 28, and you become this complete kind of being. That's the goal. And this is how he then begins this psalm, and it's really quite remarkable. Again, I'm not convinced that's there in the psalm, but it shows the originality of what Didymus will do as he begins to work through this text. As you can see here, you see all these references over here to numbers and things like this with superlinear strokes, as Didymus tries to explain this principle, and we'll even then talk you about square numbers. But it's really quite fascinating, but again, kind of suits this purpose of, okay, I want to give people this moral exhortation in these lessons. Even though I'm teaching about how to read, grammar, all this is also thrown in. And so a fascinating example, which kind of goes back to what his contemporaries are talking about with Didymus. There is, of course, much more I could say about Didymus, but what I hope is that you just get a small taste of, right, I guess in one sense, the originality of Didymus, and what he was doing as an exegete. And for me, it's this beautiful thing that somebody, right, who posthumously gets condemned, and here's kind of the irony of this condemnation, is he gets condemned with Origen, and yes, they have similar thought, but also with a man called Arius. And you probably are aware of Arius and the controversy of Alexander that breaks out in Alexandria. He gets condemned along with Arius posthumously, yet in his own lifetime, Didymus was totally opposed to Arius. But in the end, some 200 years later, he just gets condemned along with him. But is a very interesting interpreter of the scriptures. And these papyri, in a sense, are really priceless because they kind of give us this window, not only into Didymus, but also into what an early classroom, what was going on there. And so I hope in what I've said here, these last few minutes, are of some use as you think about the Tura papyri. You perhaps maybe know a little bit more about them, and a little bit more into Didymus and his contribution to fourth century Christianity, which really for the next 1500 years was basically lost until we had rediscovered Didymus and began, right, discovering him anew, right, post 1941. So that will conclude my brief discussion of Didymus, but I'd be happy to open up for questions either about this or any other part of Didymus or the Tura papyri. And I want to thank you all very much for being here this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Lincoln, about this interesting lecture, which not only about language or grammar, but also about geometry, about astronomy, about art, about the history, which we need to read again from such papyrus like this. Of course, I will open the discussion even inside the lecture or online. So if anyone have any question, please raise your hand and introduce yourself. Dr. Noha, تفضل.
For your very interesting lecture about Didymus, you have, for me, I discovered many about him, but you mentioned how he get his knowledge about the Christianity, but as he is blind, how he get his this deep and highly knowledge about classical etymology, grammatic, and also about the zodiac and about many things. How he get all this knowledge by the sense of hearing only?
Hearing, that's a very good question. Yeah, and yes, by the sources, right, they do talk about him. He is indeed blind. And you have in this passage by Sozomen, I didn't have the full passage here. He actually talks about him being, blinded as a child. It's not altogether clear how that happened, but from a wealthy family. and talks about him being this very precocious child, and in fact began, right, using his finger. His parents or his guardians would come use his finger and put them on Greek letters and begin learning. In fact, I'm not sure if that's the case, but that might be maybe the earliest reference to what we might call Braille, in the ancient world. I can't think of anything else, maybe something else older, but it talks about him doing this, and that he would love just to come and sit and hear people lecture. And it talks about him, and I always wonder, how much of this maybe is inflated a little bit, but says that he had this amazing memory, right? And talks about a lot of, the people have this amazing memory, but he could recall things. And so we just loved to sit there and would listen. And so we're just constantly listening, attending lectures, and had the means to do so, and then kind of was able to process this, and with help became this amazing lecturer where he could just begin quoting things. And so it really is quite remarkable, I think, of having blindness, what he does. Even without this is remarkable, but even with this, it's quite remarkable. But yeah, you have just a couple stories that talk about this, and there's a statement of Saint Anthony, right, and allegedly, right, goes back whether him or not, says that Didymus is an angel because he doesn't use his eyes of the mind, he uses eyes of the soul to go and interpret scripture. There's kind of compliments that are given to him. But yes, this is quite remarkable. And some of the sources mention this. Yes, because here's this person who can come and do this, having never actually read the text, physically seen this. And so, yeah, his peers are very impressed by this. And so it's really quite remarkable. But yes, thank you, Noah.
Any other question? Okay, everything is clear. Okay, thank you for your coming today, and a good lecture for us. And we hope, inshallah, you will, when we came again in Egypt next time, we will have another lecture in IFAO and with Faculty of Archaeology, inshallah, next time.
I would be honored. I just want to for Noah, I have a gift here. I brought a copy of the book that I want to give to the Papyrology Department, Ain Shams University. And so thank you. And so there you go. Put that in your collection.
Thank you.
You are very obviously gave us the recent books.
Okay.
It's our honor to get this present from you. Thank you very much. This is for the faculty.
Well, yes. Actually, we're going to
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Shukran.
Yeah. Oh. Yes.